Hello and welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. Today in Tbilisi, our guest is Ketevan Grdzelidze. She is a lecturer at the Caucasus University with her focus on cybersecurity threats. She's also a member of Cybersecurity Association. Thank you for having found time for this conversation.
Thank you for having me.
My first question is, how significant are cyber threats here in Georgia?
So firstly, we have to divide between two things: cyber threats towards nation and cyber threats towards individuals. And that's a big thing because, and then there are issues coming from the state actors and non-state actors, right? Cybercrime is a big thing in Georgia and in 21st century in general, because we have sort of tech revolution happening. We are in the midst of it, and then there is AI uprising, so to say. In terms of individual threats in cybercrime, the statistics are growing rapidly in Georgia. In terms of national security and cybersecurity of Georgia, we were one of the first countries to receive a cyber attack from a state actor, and that was in 2008 from Russia. It was right after in 2006-07 when Estonia was hit by Russian government-led groups. It's difficult to attribute whether it was from a nation state or an individual actors in cyber field, but otherwise Georgia is, especially right now with the Ukraine war for past year and a half, more than a year, we see more and more attacks in the country on the infrastructure, on critical infrastructure, on individuals, and there is a big thing with disinformation and Russian propaganda happening, which is also partly a cyber tool, partly a sort of information and news tool that is happening. One of the big issues that we are facing is computer literacy in Georgia as well. And that helps a lot in terms of attacks, because most of the attacks that are happening in Georgia are caused by the users themselves. They sort of help out the attacker in a sense too.
Well, you have already mentioned like a broad range
Yes.
of threats, like state actors, private actors, attacks on infrastructure, attacks against individuals, etc. We will address all these topics later, but before we do, don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to our channel, because this is the way that you get notified about the next interviews like that. So if we focus on what you have told already, that Georgia was one of the first countries facing a full-scale cyber attack from allegedly or probably a state actor, Russia. What were the targets of that attack?
So the targets were very broad. It was right before, so the cyber attack and preparation for a cyber attack started before the 2008 invasion. There are estimates that it was probably a few months before that the information was going out. So it was mainly a DDoS attack, what we call. That is a denial of service attack.
So it's when like you get like thousands, millions of like approaches per second.
So, so the servers are not anymore accessible. So we were sort of at the beginning of the 2008 war, we were not able to access internet. We were not able to access some of the email services, some websites. So we were sort of in an information vacuum as well. But besides that, there were attacks on the news agencies. There were attacks on some of the government web pages. But it was mainly what we see now. It was mainly a DDoS attack. That it was just a denial of service. Whether any information was retrieved behind that is difficult to estimate because it has not resurfaced. And that's an issue with DDoS attacks in general that has happened in Ukraine and Georgia as well. It's just while the server is down, you don't know what the attacker is doing behind the scenes. So if they are retrieving any critical information or some data or just defacing the web page, it's difficult to say at this point.
If we come to the nowadays situation, it is how many? It is 15 years after. What are the typical ways to attack now?
Well, DDoS still remains one of the main things. We saw it in Ukraine right before the war as well. There were attacks on banks, there were attacks on some government agencies, government web pages. Here in Georgia as well, in 2018 and 2019, we had broad attacks on our server providers. So the websites of the president of Georgia, I think some of the courts were down. There are also some of the databases that were taken out from, for example, the election center. So large information of the electorate was stolen, and then it was put on the dark web. It was probably 2015-16, I think. It comes up time to time on the dark web. Some people try to use, but the personal information, Georgian government really tries to protect it as much as they can. But the lack of service and the lack of public-private cooperation is a big thing here. So when the attack happens, it's mainly DDoS again. There is an increasing amount of spamming and phishing, what we call, but we cannot, with any credibility at this point, say that it's a government-led or there is a state actor behind. It's mostly, I would say, for some financial gain from individuals. So that goes into cybercrime rather than national security. Defacement attacks when the web pages are changed or some information is altered. That happened in 2017, I think. There was a lot of the private entities' web pages as well as the government web pages that were put on two main service providers. In Georgia, they were defaced, and there was a photo of the former president of Georgia sort of floating in to the web page saying, "I will be back." It was restored within a couple of days. It took a couple of days to sort of bring everything up to speed. But that's the main thing, that those are the main attacks that we are seeing. With cybersecurity and cyber attacks, it's a bit difficult to assess the current threats, right? Because firstly, it's very covert. You cannot always see what is happening. You cannot always immediately assess that attack has happened or something was stolen. And that goes to cyber intelligence and intelligence field in general.
But isn't it in general a characteristic of cyber threats? Yeah. You cannot, as you said before, you cannot attribute the attacker with 100% guarantee.
Yes.
That always give the attacker a way to use the plausible deniability, that were not us.
Yes, well, that's the thing. Most of the exploits that hackers use, a lot of the exploits that hackers use are readily available, so to say, and on the dark web. But there are cases when you can actually see some sort of handwriting or imprint of certain group or a certain hacker that allows to identify maybe the group that was responsible.
How is it possible? Please elaborate.
You have to look into the code and the details of the code, or how the sort of malware was launched and exploited, or who could have benefited from the information that was stolen. So in 2008, the attack was happening right together with the kinetic war, so right together with the physical altercation, so to say, with the war. So it was one of the first times when we saw the hybrid war in cyber in action, so to say. So that time that was not that difficult to assess. Yeah, that's probably a Russian-led attack. Russia never claimed any responsibility for that. They said it was some sovereign citizens who wanted to help out the state, but a lot of the states, a lot of the governments have their own sort of subgroups of hackers that are recruited for government purposes. Russia has one. I think there are certain that are in China as well, working quite well with the government or against it. It depends on, mainly the attribution thing remains a really big issue. But there are things that allow us to see the benefit or why the information was stolen. So if the government agency was hit and then some critical information was stolen, you straight away, if you're from Georgia, straight away go to first target, first idea is, it was Russian-led. but then you still have to see behind. You still have to look where the information comes up, how it could have benefited Russia or any other actor for the matter. There was one case that was very well known in international cybersecurity field, that was in Stuxnet. I don't know if
There was the Iranian industrial facility which was destroyed.
It was shut down. The whole, it's not just industrial. It was it's a power plant. It's a very big thing that happened.
Like they have, if I'm not mistaken, they have given orders to some like turbines to go into this rotation speed, which has destroyed them or something like that.
Yeah. So there was this. They were trying to. It was a nuclear facility that was hit by Stuxnet. So there was a malware that was deployed to one of the Windows computers that had the exact exploit that was into making. So it had the vulnerability. The exploit was deployed, the malware was sent, and the production process sort of was stopped altogether. So Stuxnet was said right away that was coming from the U.S. and I think the U.S. even claimed the responsibility. They said, yeah, it was us. So there's those cases as well when the government is saying, yeah, that was actually us. And then there are also hacktivist groups. It's also similar to terrorism. When a terrorist attack happens, you are sort of waiting for someone to call responsibility and claim the responsibility. With hacktivists, it's also how it happens with Anonymous. We saw it in Ukraine as well. We saw it during the Occupy Wall Street movement. They said, yeah, the DDoS attacks, some defacement attacks were made by us. So you have to look at it as sort of on a case-by-case basis and realize, yeah, what was the information? Was it, maybe it could have been someone, some, I don't know, Thorn employee who left the building and took the information with him. We had that case as well recently in 2020. There was a former employee of the security service who sort of copied every information to his thumb drive and brought out of the building once he was fired. So it can happen anything.
It's a classical revenge of a former employee.
Yeah, and it was put out on a dark web. It was really difficult to get everything back in.
But if we come like from these concrete cases to the broader situation in all the countries of South Caucasus, do we have like some difference between like three countries on cyber threats, and how typical is what is happening here? How close what is happening here is to what is happening in Ukraine or in the EU?
Well, the attacks in South Caucasus, among the states, it's more or less similar because we are at more or less similar level of development in terms of computer literacy. So our inside hackers, so to say, are at more or less the same level. So it's not way too complicated. Additionally, I have mentioned it many times, but again, DDoS remains one of the most effective tools at hand to just have an immediate effect. So if you're going for that, which Russia is doing a lot in Ukraine as well, that makes sense to use DDoS and just gather people or gather bot computers and attack and just stop the service for a while. The same has been happening in the EU quite often, but it's difficult to compare the situations because in South Caucasus, all three of the countries are more or less at war with someone. So the intelligence services are working a little bit differently here. So what is happening behind the scenes is difficult to see. In the EU, it's a little bit more calmer environment, I would say, in terms of security. I don't know if it is anymore after Ukraine, but it used to be. So you don't immediately expect someone to, just walk in your security system or walk in your critical system and shut it down. But you expect someone to try to hack your infrastructure or hack your intelligence database or security database. EU is a bit more a lot more developed than, for example, South Caucasus states in terms of cyber defense, which costs a lot. So it's understandable that South Caucasian states cannot afford themselves to have that high level cybersecurity defense in terms of national security. But with the Estonian example, Estonia and the UK are sort of leading their way in the Europe in terms of cybersecurity. So the environments altogether are very different. It's mostly here we see either direct attacks just to stop the service, or intelligence attacks, then we do not see the results for a while. It's going to take a while.
But that is exactly what I wanted to ask you, because like you clearly have like these types when you clearly see the results of the attack.
Yes.
It is either DDoS attack when your server is shut down and everyone sees that,
yes.
or it is like virus like Petya in Ukraine,
yes.
or Stuxnet in Iran, when the devastating results are so visible that there is no doubt that, okay, we have been attacked. Like,
yes.
it couldn't happen by its own. But you also have the all espionage things, when
yes.
someone is reading your emails for months, maybe for years, and you don't know.
Yes.
And then we come to the question about the quality of hardware we use, because in Europe there is this huge discussion: should we buy like some Chinese-produced modem or some servers, because we theoretically we expose ourselves for years of espionage? Like, how can one deal with all these problems simultaneously?
That's why it's a very complicated issue and very costly issue to address, to be honest. In the EU, they adopted the GDPR that sort of tries to save the personal information as much as it can, and then there are additional regulations in terms of what hardware can be imported, what not. For Caucasus, it has been a very difficult road in terms of hardware that we buy. Most of the companies, the larger companies, they have their residences, they have their quarters in Russia, and then from Russia they cover the Caucasus as well. And Russian government has this request that every hardware that goes through Russia and that is imported in and out of Russia should have some sort of, how to explain it easily, it's the tracker thing, so they can check.
The backdoors for
sort
FSB?
Of, yes.
But do you mean, like, when you say companies, do you mean like IT companies, provider, mobile?
Yeah, service providers. I mean, that would be, for example, most of the Android phones, Samsung phones were imported from Russia. So if you buy, I don't know for 2023 how it has changed right now, but if you would buy in 2022, for example, a Samsung phone in a shop in Georgia, then for the guarantee you would call a Russian number, because that's how it's coming in.
So you buy a Samsung phone or other phone here in Tbilisi, and it is a phone which has been imported through Russia with Russian pre-installed something.
And a lot of the users don't know that. You look at the number on the box where you have to call for activating the warranty, and then it's actually imported. It's a Russian number. You call the Russian number. And it doesn't ring that many bells, because it has been like that for a really long time.
Was it seen as a matter of national threat by the government?
It is being now. I mean, as for now, I would expect they will change the regulations, and maybe it's also difficult to do so, because you cannot really force Samsung. You know, you have to open a sort of branch here in Georgia, or even in Armenia or Azerbaijan, just because of me. But once these big companies stopped sort of communicating with Russia and closed their shops in Russia, I would expect that the situation has a little bit changed. As for the international service providers, as what you have mentioned, we are mainly covered from Ireland. So, for example, for Facebook, Google, the law enforcement would address the Irish branch to retrieve some information, or the US, depending on the type of the information. But in terms of hardware, it's a big thing here. We have had those discussions for years now. We are working on a new security concept in Georgia, and there has been talks that maybe even some Chinese hardware providers will probably be banned from entering Georgia. I don't think it's going to go that strictly as to banning them, but we will try to follow in the steps of the EU, I would guess. So if they will announce that it's a threat, then we'll probably try to figure some way to reduce the number of the devices that are that are somewhat vulnerable, that are making us somewhat vulnerable. But it's also a big issue here, and I think in all three states, is the issue of unlicensed software. In the EU, you would rarely see, for example, like cracked Windows running on a computer, especially on a government or some bureaucratic computer. Here, most of the computers are running on the unlicensed Windows. So
you already buy like pirated OS, and then you install it, and you actually don't know what you have installed.
You have no idea what you have installed, and you have also no idea for what purposes your information will be used. The government agencies, I think, have switched to licensed softwares a while ago, because we are big on the e-governance in general. So you cannot have e-governance and also run on the unlicensed software. So I think the government will take some more steps in terms of making sure that even the individual computers are running on the licensed software.
But if we go to this, I think, really scary thing, do you know the tool you use? And it's not only about the hardware or software, it's also about the messengers you use. Like in Ukraine, the fresh case is many Ukrainian units use like Telegram and other messengers, and you don't know who is reading your messages, as long as a messenger can be associated with Russia.
Yes, that was a big thing with Telegram, actually. But here as well, I mean, there was this illusion that WhatsApp cannot be tracked. There are ways to track WhatsApp communications. It's end-to-end encrypted, yes, but since Facebook bought it, we still don't know what's happening there. With Telegram as well, I mean, Telegram, I would guess it's a little bit more secure than Facebook Messenger. Nothing against Facebook Messenger, I use it quite often. It's just you have to know what tools to use for what information. So, as I mentioned before, computer literacy is a big problem here, and the government, together with some educational institutions, is trying to implement as many educational programs as you can, especially for teens who are using TikTok a lot, who are using Facebook, Instagram. So you have to understand the threats that come together with it. When you're using certain messengers and certain chat tools, you have to understand that any information can be tracked. It depends how vulnerable your device actually is. So if someone has already accessed your phone or your laptop, you can be tracked whether you're using dark web or you're using Telegram or whatever. Then there is the issue that the service providers themselves inform you that there are certain things, there are certain vulnerabilities that you have to be aware of. For example, if you're using a Facebook Messenger and then you're trying to relay some very secret information, you don't do that on Facebook. You try to find a way to secure your information. There was a big surge on usage of Telegram in 2022. Right after the Ukraine conflict started, because Telegram is sort of unfiltered source of information, but it also, there are things that allow attacker or any other person to track Telegram communications, but it's really, really difficult at this point to do. So one of the most secure ones that is very popular right now would be probably Telegram, but not, in Georgia, WhatsApp is very, very popular among the people who try to secure their communication, but it's also very difficult because, again, FSB has access to your phone, so it can access any information that is stored on the phone. So you have to make sure that when you delete your message, for example, it's deleted from the server, but also from your phone. So it's a bit complicated thing.
Yeah, that's exactly the crucial thing. You can think that the messenger is secure, but if someone has access to your phone directly, then there is no secure thing on your phone. Don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to our channel so you have direct access to all our next interviews. And now the next question. Okay. You have mentioned the messengers and all the communication things, but it's not only about like how you secure your communication. but also how you defend yourself against like misinformation, against propaganda campaign. How much is Georgia and other countries in the region are being affected by propaganda campaigns in social networks?
It's one of the biggest issues and challenges that we are facing at this point. Russian propaganda, I would say directly. I mean, the political, government, opposition, but in general, Russian propaganda has been a big issue and big challenge in Georgia. And you can see that if there is some, for example, during the COVID period, there was a vaccination, anti-COVID movement that started in Russia, and you can actually see the same messages in Georgian groups as well on Facebook. So it's a big thing that the government has to face. They are trying to take proactive steps in terms of securing the society sort of from the disinformation, but that's really difficult to do in an open source environment, right? So you cannot control what comes comes up on the screen for everyone. So we have a lot of groups and a lot of private groups also working, firstly, towards removing the disinformation from social networks, for example. There are also additionally a lot of projects implemented from the government, but from also the civil society to inform society about how the information can be misleading, how the disinformation tools work, how you cannot trust every bit of information that you see on your Facebook. But we have to understand one thing. In beginning of 2000s is when sort of computers came to Georgia, also in South Caucasus in general. So you have a generation, a newer generation who has grown up with the devices and internet and access, and they are more able to filter through the all of the data that comes across their desks. But you also have a 50 plus, 60 plus generation that is using Facebook or any newspaper web page on the internet. They are less able to filter through this, and they are sort of more trusting towards everything they see on the internet. So the computer literacy becomes really important in these cases. You have to explain and sort of not only proactively block the information, because that is also a very sort of scary path to go down to, because you cannot always be sure that you have to fact check then everything, and the government doesn't have that resources, and it's an open source, everyone can post anything, and then it can become viral. So you have to rely on the idea that you can get through to people, to society, and explain to them that that these are the signs of disinformation. These are the signs that this can be a propaganda. You have to look beyond the words that are written on your screen. So it's an ongoing thing. We have a lot of new legislation coming in terms of disinformation and information security in general. We have a lot of groups from the civil society and activists working towards that, and having workshops, having meetings in rural areas in Georgia to sort of tackle the issue and bring as much awareness as possible that there are things that can be beneficial for Russian propaganda, and you have to be sort of vigilant about it and understand the threat behind it.
How much understanding of this disinformation threat are among the support offices of Meta, like of Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, and others? The Ukrainians have a lot of claims that Meta does not always support Ukrainian claims against Russian disinformation, but vice versa. A lot of Ukrainian accounts have been blocked since the start of full-scale invasion. Is it a similar situation here?
A lot of activists, a lot of civil groups try to report as much as they can in terms of propaganda, but you have to understand the policy of Meta. If it's not direct, outright lie or outright sort of danger to someone, then they might take a more liberal approach to removing the information. But it has become more apparent that Meta is flagging a lot of articles, a lot of information that can be wrong or can be part of propaganda. You can always see that even if you open, for example, some article, before you open on the post, you can see that this has been flagged as a propaganda.
That is what Twitter has recently removed
Yes,
from their policy.
Twitter has taken a whole another approach towards liberal information spread, I would guess, and free speech. But we have, well, as I said, there are several groups that are working towards that. There is also a communication and cooperation between the law enforcement agencies and the international service providers. We have pretty good statistics, I would say, in terms of removing or accessing the information the legal way, I would say, through Meta, through sometimes it has to be through DOJ, the US, because their headquarters is there, or the server that the information is stored is there. But in terms of removing the information, it's a really long process, and a lot of people try to avoid it because Meta has also a lot of questions. You have to prove very in details that it is actually a propaganda and not the not someone's positions, for example. So it's a difficult process. A lot of accounts have been removed by Meta. There was a big thing of removing bot accounts, and then there was also statistics coming through whether it was from government or from opposition, and the pretty popular pages, I would say, were blocked. Their Georgian pages were blocked because they were part of the disinformation tool. So it's an ongoing process. It has become better in the recent 2 years, I would guess. The cooperation, communication with Meta, but you always have to look at the policies of the service providers themselves. I mean, it's if they say we have again with the same with Twitter, you know, it's Twitter allows everything and every nonsense to be posted there. So it's their policy, it's their approach. They said we want to do it this way. Meta takes a bit more, I don't want to say responsible way, but they have a bit more responsible way to approach the propaganda issues, but it's still a very difficult process to go through.
Well, struggle, fight against the propaganda, against cyber threats, for computer literacy and for more secure informational space. That is never-ending process, but it doesn't mean that we do not need to go that way to secure our communication. That was an interview with Ketevan Grdzelidze. She's a lecturer and researcher at the Caucasus University in Tbilisi and also a member of Association on Cyber Security. Thank you for this interview.
Thank you for having me.
See you again.